You sit down to begin something important, a report you need to finish, a chapter you promised yourself you would study, work that actually moves your life forward. For a moment, your intention feels clear. You open the document, you read the first line, you prepare to begin. And then something small appears, a notification, a message, a thought about something easier you could check quickly. Your attention moves for just a moment. You open another tab. You glance at your phone. You tell yourself it will only take a second. But seconds have a way of stretching. A few minutes pass, then a few more. And when you finally look back at the task you meant to begin, something strange has happened. The work now feels heavier than it did a moment earlier, more difficult, more demanding. You hesitate. The momentum is gone. You decide you will start in a few minutes instead. But the few minutes stretch longer, and the thing you intended to do quietly disappears from your day. And if you pay attention to moments like this, you begin to notice something unsettling. The decision did not happen when you delayed the work. It happened earlier, in a moment so small you almost never notice it. The moment your attention quietly moved somewhere easier. Most people explain moments like this in a simple way. They say they lacked discipline. They assume they needed more motivation. They believe they should have pushed themselves harder. But that explanation hides something important. Because the real decision did not happen when you delayed the task. It happened earlier. Much earlier. In the quiet moment when your attention first moved away from the work, long before discipline had any chance to act, your mind chose the easier path. And the strange part is that you rarely experience that moment as a decision. It feels natural, automatic, almost invisible. Which means something uncomfortable becomes true.
Much of what you call decision-making is not actually deliberate. It is automatic. The mind is constantly searching for the path that requires the least effort. And the moment it finds one, attention quietly shifts in that direction. Which explains why the same pattern appears again and again in daily life. You open your phone without thinking. You check something you checked only minutes earlier. You delay beginning a difficult task, even though you know it matters. Each moment seems small, almost insignificant, but together they reveal something deeper about how the mind actually works. Because the mind is always negotiating with effort, it keeps asking a quiet question. Is there an easier path? And the moment the answer becomes yes, attention begins drifting in that direction almost immediately. Not because you consciously decided it should, but because the mind is designed to move toward whatever requires the least effort. Effort begins to feel heavier. The task you intended to do now feels more demanding than it did moments earlier. And that change in feeling quietly influences what happens next. You hesitate. You delay. You promise yourself you will return to it later. But often, you do not. This pattern is so common that most people assume it reflects a lack of discipline. But the problem usually begins much earlier than discipline. It begins in the moment the mind first encounters effort. Because effort is something the brain is constantly trying to reduce. Thinking deeply requires energy. Sustained concentration requires energy. Analyzing complex ideas requires energy. And the brain is designed to conserve that energy whenever possible. Which means the moment an easier option appears, the mind feels a subtle pull toward it. A notification, a message, a quick distraction. Each one offers the same promise. Less effort, less resistance, less mental strain. and the mind moves toward that promise almost automatically. Which leads to a realization that many people find uncomfortable. The human mind does not naturally choose what is most important. It chooses what is easiest. And once that choice begins shaping your behavior, everything else quietly reorganizes around it. Your attention moves, your effort changes, your priorities shift, and the difficult thing you intended to do slowly fades into the background of your day. This is why productivity advice often feels ineffective. People are told to be more disciplined, more motivated, more determined. But those instructions are aimed at the wrong moment in the process. Because by the time discipline becomes relevant, the mind has usually already chosen a direction, the easier path. And once that choice happens, effort begins working against you instead of with you. Which explains a strange experience many people recognize. You can begin the day with clear intentions. You know exactly what you plan to accomplish. You even feel motivated. But as the day unfolds, small decisions accumulate. You check something quickly. You delay something briefly. You choose a slightly easier option in a moment of hesitation. Each decision seems harmless on its own, but together they gradually move your attention away from what matters most. And by the end of the day, you feel something difficult to explain. You were busy, you were active, but the work that actually mattered never fully happened. Most people respond to this experience by blaming themselves. They believe they lack discipline. They believe something about their character is weak, but the explanation is usually much simpler. The mind was following its natural tendency, the tendency to reduce effort whenever possible. This tendency was studied extensively by the psychologist Daniel Kahneman. Kahneman spent decades examining how the mind actually makes decisions. What he discovered was surprisingly simple. The human mind prefers ease. Whenever it has the option to think less, it usually will. Whenever it has the option to act with less effort, it usually will. And most of the time, this tendency operates beneath conscious awareness. Which means many of the choices you believe you are making deliberately are actually being shaped by something much quieter. The mind's constant search for the easiest possible path. This simply clarifies the break in ideas. The mind's constant search for the easiest possible path. This does not mean the mind is lazy. It means the mind is efficient. The brain consumes a tremendous amount of energy relative to the rest of the body, and because of that, it evolved to conserve energy whenever possible. Thinking deeply, solving complex problems, maintaining long periods of concentration, all of these require significant mental resources. So the brain constantly looks for shortcuts, patterns, habits, familiar routines that allow it to operate with less effort. This is extremely useful in many situations. Without these shortcuts, even simple daily tasks would feel exhausting. But the same mechanism that makes life efficient can also quietly guide your behavior toward the easiest available option, especially when something difficult appears in front of you. Because difficulty signals effort, and effort signals energy cost. So the mind begins searching for alternatives, something easier, something quicker, something that allows it to avoid that cost. You can see this process clearly when you attempt to begin something mentally demanding. The moment difficulty appears, a series of subtle impulses begin surfacing. Check something quickly, look something up, think about something else. Each impulse offers the same promise, a small escape from effort. And if attention follows that impulse, the difficult task immediately becomes harder to return to, because attention has already moved somewhere easier. This is why so many moments of procrastination feel strangely rational in the moment. You convince yourself the delay makes sense. You tell yourself you will return to the task shortly. But the real shift happened earlier.
when the mind first recognized an easier alternative and quietly chose it. Which means the real struggle behind productivity is not simply about discipline. It is about understanding how the mind interacts with effort. Because once effort appears, the mind begins searching for ways to reduce it. And unless you recognize that pattern, the easier path will almost always win. This realization changes how you see many of your own decisions. The distractions you follow, the tasks you delay, the habits that seem to repeat themselves even when you know they are not helping you. Many of them are not the result of conscious choice. They are the result of the mind quietly moving toward what requires the least effort. And once you begin noticing that movement, something interesting happens. You start seeing the easy path everywhere. In the conversations you avoid, in the thinking you postpone, in the work you delay because something slightly easier appears. At first, these moments seem small, but over time they accumulate into something much larger. Because each time the mind chooses the easier path, it reinforces the same pattern. Difficulty appears. Attention searches for escape. The easier option wins. And that cycle slowly shapes the direction of your behavior. Which raises an uncomfortable question. If the mind naturally prefers the easiest path, what happens to the difficult things that actually matter? The skills that require long practice, the ideas that require deep thinking, the goals that require sustained effort. Those things rarely appear as the easiest option in the moment, which means without understanding this tendency inside the mind, they are constantly competing against something powerful, the brain's preference for ease. And that competition quietly shapes far more of your life than most people realize, because the path of least resistance appears again and again in daily decisions. Small choices, small moments, small shifts of attention, but together they determine which direction your life slowly begins to move. And if that pattern continues long enough, something deeper begins to change. You stop trusting your own intentions. You begin trusting the easier path instead. Which leads to a question that Daniel Kahneman spent much of his career exploring. If the mind naturally chooses the easier path, can it learn to choose differently? Because if the mind continues following the easiest direction available, something predictable begins to happen. Attention grows weaker. Effort begins to feel heavier. And the difficult things that shape your future slowly lose the competition for your focus. Not because you lack intelligence, not because you lack ambition, but because the mind quietly learned that the easier path always wins. Which means the real question is not simply how to become more disciplined. The real question is something much deeper. What would have to change inside the mind for the harder path to finally become possible? Because if nothing changes, the easier path quietly becomes the default direction of your life. Small decisions repeat. Small distractions accumulate. And over time, the mind becomes more comfortable with ease than with effort, until the harder path begins to feel unfamiliar. And more importantly, what actually happens inside the mind when it does? To understand why the mind chooses the easier path so often, you have to look at how thinking itself actually works. Most people imagine the mind as a single process, a unified system that carefully analyzes information before making decisions. But when psychologists began studying human judgment more closely, they discovered something unexpected. The mind is not a single system. It operates as two very different processes working side by side. And those two processes handle effort in completely different ways. Daniel Kahneman spent decades studying this phenomenon. What he discovered revealed something fundamental about how the mind handles effort. Some thinking is fast, instant, automatic. It happens without deliberate control. You recognize a familiar face. You read simple words on a screen. You sense danger before you consciously understand why. All of these reactions occur immediately. They require almost no effort. The mind processes them effortlessly. But there is another kind of thinking. Slower, deliberate, demanding. This type of thinking appears when something requires real concentration. Solving a complex problem, learning something unfamiliar, analyzing a difficult decision. These situations require sustained mental effort.
And the mind reacts to that effort very differently.
The first type of thinking operates automatically. The second type must be activated intentionally, which means the mind naturally prefers the first, because it requires less energy. Kahneman described this difference as two modes of thinking, one fast and automatic, the other slow and effortful. But the important detail is not simply that two systems exist. The important detail is which one the mind prefers. Whenever the mind has the opportunity to remain in the easier mode, it usually does. Not because the slow mode is impossible, but because activating it requires effort, and the brain is constantly trying to conserve energy, which means the easier system becomes the mind's default. You can observe this preference almost everywhere in daily life. Consider how quickly the mind jumps to conclusions. You hear part of a story and assume you understand the rest. You glance at a headline and believe you know what the article says. You meet someone and form an impression within seconds. All of these reactions happen before deliberate thought even begins, because the fast system is already working, producing answers before the slower system has even entered the conversation. It produces immediate impressions, immediate interpretations, immediate answers. And most of the time, those answers feel convincing, which is why the slow system rarely intervenes. The mind accepts the first explanation that appears because questioning it would require effort. This tendency reveals something important. The fast system is not designed for accuracy.
It is designed for efficiency. It generates answers quickly, so the mind can continue operating without spending unnecessary energy. In many situations, this works perfectly well. You do not need slow, deliberate reasoning to recognize a familiar object. You do not need deep analysis to respond to simple everyday situations. But problems begin to appear when the fast system begins handling situations that actually require deeper thinking. Because the fast system does not analyze, it reacts. It fills in missing information. It creates quick explanations that feel correct even when they are not. And once those explanations appear, the mind rarely challenges them. The slower system remains silent, unless something forces it to engage. Which brings us back to the easy path. Because the fast system almost always represents the easier path, it requires less effort, less concentration, less mental strain. So when the mind has the option to rely on it, that is usually what happens, even when the situation would benefit from deeper thinking. This explains many patterns that people struggle with in their own behavior. You intend to think something through carefully, but your mind produces an answer almost instantly. You assume the first answer must be correct. You move on without examining it further. The fast system has already done the work, and the slow system never becomes involved. The same pattern appears when you confront something difficult. The moment a task requires real concentration, the mind feels resistance, because activating the slower system requires energy, and energy is something the brain constantly tries to conserve. So the mind begins searching for alternatives, something easier, something quicker, something that allows it to remain in the effortless mode. This is the hidden mechanism behind many moments of distraction. You begin reading something complex. Your attention drifts. You check something simple instead. The fast system takes over again, no effort required. Or you begin working on a difficult problem. After a few minutes, your mind begins looking for escape, a message,
a notification, a quick task that feels easier to complete. Again, the mind is moving toward the system that requires less effort. And once that shift happens, returning to the difficult task becomes harder. Because the slow system must be activated again, and activation requires energy. Which means something subtle begins shaping your behavior. The mind is constantly balancing effort. It weighs the cost of thinking deeply against the comfort of remaining in automatic mode. And whenever the cost feels too high, attention begins drifting towards something easier. Not deliberately, not consciously, but consistently. This is why many people underestimate the influence of mental effort. They assume their decisions reflect careful reasoning, but in reality, the fast system often supplies the answer long before reasoning begins. And once the answer appears, the mind rarely questions it, because questioning requires activating the slower system, which means the easier path wins again. Over time, this pattern begins shaping more than individual decisions. It shapes habits. The mind begins learning which actions require effort and which do not. The effortless ones repeat. The difficult ones are postponed. And gradually, the easier behaviors become automatic, which means something important begins to happen inside the mind. The fast system begins handling more and more situations. The slow system becomes quieter. Not because it disappeared, but because the mind is practicing one more than the other. And any ability that is used less frequently gradually becomes harder to activate. This explains why deep thinking can feel difficult for many people, not because they are incapable of it, but because the mind has become accustomed to operating in the effortless mode. The fast system handles most situations. The slow system activates only occasionally, and when it does activate, the effort feels uncomfortable, which makes the mind eager to return to the easier mode again. This is why the easy path becomes so powerful. It is not simply a single decision. It is a pattern the mind gradually learns to follow. Difficulty appears. The fast system searches for an easier option. Attention shifts. Effort disappears. And the cycle repeats. The more often this cycle repeats, the more natural it begins to feel, until eventually the easier path becomes the mind's default response to difficulty. This is the point where many people begin feeling frustrated with themselves. They notice their attention drifting constantly. They notice their difficulty maintaining focus. They notice how easily distractions capture their mind. But they assume the problem is motivation or discipline, when in reality, the mind is simply following a pattern it has practiced many times before. The pattern of choosing the easier system whenever possible. Which means the real challenge is not forcing the mind to work harder. The real challenge is understanding when the fast system is operating. Because once you can recognize that moment, something important becomes possible. The slower system can finally intervene. And when it does, something interesting begins to happen. The mind pauses. Instead of reacting immediately, it examines the situation more carefully. It considers alternatives. It evaluates consequences. It asks questions the fast system never asked. This shift does not happen automatically. It requires awareness. But when it happens, the easy path loses some of its influence because the mind is no longer operating entirely on autopilot. And that moment of awareness is where real control begins. Not by eliminating the fast system. That system is essential. But by recognizing when it is quietly making decisions for you and choosing, occasionally, to slow the mind down long enough to examine them. Because the moment the slower system becomes active, something changes. The easy path is no longer the only option the mind can see. And when the mind begins seeing more than one option, a different kind of decision becomes possible. Not the automatic one, but the deliberate one. And that difference between reacting automatically and choosing deliberately is where the real power of the mind begins to appear. You can observe this difference when you pay attention to how quickly the mind produces explanations. Someone says something unexpected. Within seconds, your mind generates an interpretation.
You assume you understood what they meant, and you respond immediately.
But if you pause and examine the situation more carefully, another possibility sometimes appears. The first interpretation was not necessarily correct. It was simply the fastest one available. Because the fast system answers quickly, accuracy is not its priority. Speed is. This is how the fast system operates. It fills gaps quickly. It produces stories that feel convincing. And because those stories arrive instantly, the mind rarely questions them. The slower system would question them, but questioning requires effort, which means most of the time, the first explanation quietly becomes the final one. This same pattern appears when you evaluate your own decisions. You delay something important. Almost immediately, your mind produces a justification. You were tired. You were busy. You needed a break. Each explanation feels reasonable in the moment, but often those explanations appear only after the decision has already happened. The fast system creates a story that makes the easier choice feel acceptable. And because the explanation arrives so quickly, it feels like the decision was deliberate, even when it was not. Over time, this creates a powerful illusion. You begin believing your choices were deliberate, when, in reality, many of them were automatic. The easy path appeared. The fast system followed it, and the explanation arrived afterward. Which means something important begins to happen if this pattern continues long enough. The fast system starts handling more and more of your decisions. The slow system becomes quieter. Not because it disappeared, but because it is rarely being used. And any ability that is rarely used gradually weakens. Which means the mind slowly becomes more comfortable with speed than with depth, more comfortable with reaction than with reflection. And once that happens,
the easy path becomes even easier to follow. But that raises another important question. If the mind naturally prefers the easier system, what determines when the slower system finally activates? Because most of the time, it does not. The fast system answers quickly. The easy path appears immediately, and attention moves before deeper thinking even begins. Which means understanding that moment becomes extremely important. The moment when the mind finally slows down. The moment when automatic reaction pauses. Because that is the point where the pattern can finally be interrupted. The easy path is no longer the only direction the mind can see. And once the mind begins to see more than one direction, a different kind of decision becomes possible. If this helped you see how your mind actually makes decisions, take a moment to like the video. And if you want to keep developing that kind of control over your thinking, subscribe to the channel.